So let's get into the major mind shocks. There's also reports that were there two tents that were cut with a knife, one the day before and one that same night. I mean, it's kind of hard to corroborate this. And then also, of course, there were plenty. Here's an interesting write-up with some more anomalies. The Mysteries of the 1977 Camp Scott, Oklahoma Girl Scout Murders by Bill 422, 2 years ago on the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. The 1977 murder of 3 Girl Scouts at Camp Scott in Oklahoma is a very, very popular mystery with many articles written about it, and it has been discussed here many times. So I'm simply going to give a brief overview and then list some of the sticking points that keep me wondering about that night. And these are some sticking points indeed. For those who aren't familiar with it, the case revolves around Camp Scott. This was a Girl Scout camp in Mays County, Oklahoma. Campers would stay there, and at night they would sleep in tents arranged in units, with a Kiowa unit that was involved in the case having 8 tents, one of which was for the counselors. Around May 77, camp staff found a note stating that 3 campers were going to be killed. Some stuff was stolen as well. The day of the murders, a tent was found cut with a knife. The next morning, June 13th, 1977, 3 campers were found sexually assaulted and killed, and their bodies were found in the area surrounding the campsite. Although no one was convicted, most people believe that Jean Leroy Hart was the suspect. A later DNA test showed that there was a 1 in 7,700 chance that Hart was in fact the killer, although some question whether he was alone or with someone else. And I am going to jump in here with another point. If they were trying to frame Jean Leroy Hart, it is not difficult to swap DNA samples. In fact, that is the most common form of planting and law enforcement corruption in cases. I'll actually be doing an episode on that in the Stephen Avery case. A lot of goofs believe that it's impossible that he was framed, or that it would have been too hard work on site at the Avery salvage yard to plant stuff. All you got to do is switch some labels in the lab. So if, again, I'm not alleging this is true or untrue, but if the fix was in and law enforcement wanted to frame Hart, now keep in mind, I went over in episode 1, Hart had even burglarized police officers' houses. And the sheriff himself supposedly had previous run-ins with Hart over other cases. So they knew him. And they might have specifically wanted to pin him, whether they thought he did it or not. Maybe they really did think he did it, but the evidence wasn't there, so they planted it. Maybe they really thought he was the guy. Maybe they didn't care. Or maybe they knew he wasn't the guy. But either way, it's not difficult to swap a label. So even the DNA test, which is a 1 in 7,700 chance, which of course doesn't mean that much. I mean, that's nowhere near beyond a reasonable doubt. But even that might not be accurate. That might not be accurate at all. So let's not fall for these logical fallacies. Continuing on with the post here, my questions and ongoing thoughts about this case, however, are more about the events leading up to it and how those events went unreported. And these are also very, very critical. Do they point to Hart, or do they point to pranksters escalating to violence and murder from the neighboring Boy Scout camp? First, there is a note found a couple weeks beforehand that 3 campers were going to be murdered. Stuff was stolen. From my understanding, this was attributed to a prank from a Boy Scout camp. While I don't personally see threatening to kill 3 young kids as funny, I can understand how in the 1970s it was simply written off as being a prank from a 17 or 18-year-old Boy Scout counselor. Plus, with little specific information, it would be too vague to act on anyway, so I can understand this one. Second, earlier in the day, on the date of the murders would take place, a counselor found one of the tents in the unit had been cut open with a knife. I imagine this should have been rather alarming, that someone had a knife and was cutting up a heavy fabric tent with it. But again, I can see this being written off at the time. From here, things seem more baffling to me. Third, a counselor in another unit, a short distance away, sees a dim flashlight moving through the woods between 8 and 10 p.m. So this is quite a few hours before the attacks. As there were miles of woods around, this was in a remote area, one would think this would be pretty alarming. I understand that at the time there were no cell phones or anything, so the counselor couldn't just send a text to one of the counselors in the Kiowa unit, and perhaps they mistook where the light was coming from and thought it was just someone in the Kiowa unit walking around. But still, I would be rather concerned if I were in the middle of the woods where no one else should be and saw a dim flashlight in the distance moving towards the camp. Another point here, too, if this was Hart or possibly other adults, would they really be hanging around for so many hours? Whereas possibly Boy Scouts from the neighboring camp who are used to sneaking in and out might feel confident to do that, and also young and stupid enough to do that. Fourth, and to me, one of the most concerning events. In the early morning hours, a dim flashlight is seen in the woods coming closer to the campsite. I can't find the article, but if I recall, it was one of the counselors from the Kiowa unit that saw this. To me, this really should have set alarm bells off. A dim flashlight in the woods where no one should be, slowly moving towards the campsite. Now, I understand the counselors were only around 18, and I'm not trying to blame them in any way, but it baffles me that someone would see a dim flashlight in the woods coming towards the tents at 1 or 2 in the morning and simply ignore it and go back to sleep. I can only wonder if the campers would still be alive if someone just raised the alarm at this point. Fifth, also, in the early morning hours, the two counselors in the Kiowa unit get up after hearing a commotion in one of the tents. After this, they hear a guttural sound. Presumably, it is the sound of one of the girls being raped near the counselor's tent. The counselors get nervous and think it is an animal and go back to their tent. This again makes me wonder. It seems like even a small flashlight shown in that direction may very well have illuminated the man who killed the girls. And although we'll never know, perhaps if the counselors had checked on this, perhaps one or more of the scouts could have been saved. Like I said, I'm not trying to blame anyone, especially 18-year-olds, but I just can't wrap my head around it. For several people to ignore a dim flashlight in the woods moving towards the camp, to not shine a light when you hear a guttural growl near you in the woods. If any one of these things had raised the alarm bell, maybe things would have turned out better. What do you all make of these events? Am I overthinking it? Okay, I actually have answers here. So first of all, this doesn't even include the account of one of the girls in the tent that we viewed on that news report from around 1990, where she stated that they reported it and they were told to shut up and that it was nothing. So here's the explanation here. If these were boys from the Boy Scout camp that the counselors knew about and knew they were pulling pranks, did they simply write them off as pranks because there were previous pranks? They possibly even knew who exactly was doing the pranks. So they wrote it off because why are they going to go around chasing boys in the woods when they already know who they are and they know that, or in their minds, they could never imagine that they would actually harm anybody. They were just pranksters running around with flashlights. Especially if they did this multiple times prior, possibly even making crazy noises to try to scare people. So if they knew all of that, would they be more justified in writing it off and ignoring it because they knew where it was coming from and in their own minds they did not believe it was any real threat? Now, again, let's not fall for false dichotomies. Is it possible, because this was reported that there were pranks from the Boy Scout camp, is it possible they were around with flashlights, but they were not the perpetrators of this crime? So that explains the multiple sets of flashlights. So perhaps the true perpetrators, if they were actually older men, not these teenage Boy Scouts, did they go into the camp? Did they know about the pranksters and they wanted to use that as a cover? Because if they did, and they did use that as a cover, I mean, that would be kind of smart. Especially if they knew that these counselors knew about the pranksters from the camp, so they wouldn't suspect random flashlights in the woods, so they would be more brazen about using flashlights. I mean, this is quite a tangled web, but again, here on MindShock, we're not falling for any logical fallacies. We don't know what is or isn't true. We don't know how many scenarios could have been in play. I mean, these are all valid variables that need to be considered. So here's an interesting article, the Talakoya Daily Press. Crime Rewind. Officials say Girl Scout murder case unsolved. Investigators believe some in the area may have information about the crime. November 11th, 2021. An unspeakable crime that occurred nearly 45 years ago in the nearby Mayes County remains unsolved to this day, but some law enforcement authorities haven't given up on the case. On June 12, 1977, 140 Girl Scouts set off to Camp Scott to spend 2 weeks learning about hiking, cooking, swimming, and more. But in the early morning of June 13th, camp counselor Carla Wilt in the Kiowa unit stumbled across the bodies of 3 campers in Tent 8. The girls were Michelle Heather Goose, Doris Denise Milner, and Lori Lee Farmer. Local law enforcement officials were on the scene by 7:30 a.m., and now retired Cherokee County investigator Jack Goss was among the first to arrive. I did get up to the scene the day it happened because all surrounding counties were sending people to help, said Goss. Camp Scott was evacuated at about 10 a.m., and the campers were returned to Tulsa to their families. Investigators initially withheld details of the crime, and Mayes County Sheriff Glenn H. Pete Weaver believed he knew who was responsible, Gene Leroy Hart. And it's also curious how soon he knew who was responsible. Was it immediately before there was any evidence gathered? Because that would be curious, because that's what happened in the Stephen Avery case. Gene Leroy Hart. Weaver's suspect had just escaped from jail before the murders occurred. A 10-month manhunt ensued before Hart was found hiding in a cabin in Cherokee County. You can imagine just how many reports of him spotted we received. He was fishing down at Etta Bend with Sam Pigeon, and we arrested Sam also and then turned him loose, said Goss. Hart pleaded not guilty to the murders and was on trial in March 79 with Garvin Isaacs and Gary Pitchlin representing him. The jury listened as the state's case focused on hair and semen samples found on the bodies. Dr. John McLeod, fertility expert at Cornell University Medical Center, testified the sperm linked to Hart. Experts argued several items found in a cave a few miles away from Camp Scott were also connected to Hart. But Isaacs argued that evidence was planted to frame an innocent man. Both defense attorneys claimed the culprit was Kansas convict William Stevens, who was serving time for rape and kidnappings. Jurors deliberated 10 days and rendered a verdict sooner than anyone anticipated. On March 30th, 1979, Hart was acquitted and returned to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, where he collapsed and died from a heart attack just 2 months later. Again, Hart dying from a heart attack. Age 35. I mean, how weird is that? Many longtime area residents agree with Weaver and still believe Hart was the perpetrator. But others close to the case aren't so sure and think there are still some area residents who may have information about what happened. Weaver locked in on Gene Leroy Hart and stayed with it, said Goss. Current Cherokee County Sheriff Jason Chenault, Goss, and a ranking state-level law enforcement source closely involved with the case say they believe that the 1977 murder of Jimmy Dean Bryan may offer a lead. According to Goss, a man named Pete Duffield called him August 3rd, 1977, and claimed his sons, Wesley and Jesse Darrell, had killed Bryan, and that his body could be found at Eldon. Goss and then Tahlequah Police Department Detective Darrell Scott, who later became Cherokee County Sheriff, arrested Wesley the day Bryan's body was discovered. Wesley claimed Bryan had stolen marijuana from him and then said he stole $50,000 from him, so he killed him. Wait, where do these people have this kind of money? This is the 70s. During a taped interview made December 4th, 1990, a relative of Bryan's, John Rotramel, alleged he, the Duffields, and Jimmy and Bobby Bryan were at Barren Fork Creek a few weeks after the Girl Scout murders. Rotramel told authorities the Duffield brothers had asked him who he thought killed the Girl Scouts. He said the Duffield brothers told him Hart didn't do it, but they claimed they knew who did. Shortly afterward, Jimmy Bryan told family members the Duffield brothers were upset with him because he wanted to speak with authorities. Jimmy disappeared, and his brother's father, Pete Duffield, eventually called Goss to tell him where Jimmy's body was. Pete shot himself a few hours later. This is kind of weird. This is definitely kind of weird. So Pete Duffield calls Goss August 3rd, 77, claiming that his sons killed Brian. So did he commit suicide, allegedly, if this really was a suicide, because his sons killed a man, or because he believed they killed the Girl Scouts, or possibly both? Really weird. Okay. Now, Jimmy Bryan told family members that the Duffield brothers were upset with him. And then Jimmy disappeared. So he didn't disappear before he talked to several family members. Interesting. From an investigator's standpoint, what's significant about this, as near as we can tell, Rotramel had absolutely no reason to make that up, said the source who has been close to the investigation for over 40 years. That's the first thing I saw that made me think there's a story out here somewhere, and Jack and I started working on the case then. So Johnny Rotramel is a relative of Brian. And he, Jimmy, and Bobby Bryan, as well as the Duffields, were the ones that were at Barren Fork Creek a few weeks after the Girl Scout murders. Wow, okay. Okay, so at some point afterwards, they became upset with Jimmy Bryan. Mary Jane Jones was 19 years old in 1977, and she revealed information in a written statement in 2008 at the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office that suggested the Duffields might have information about the Girl Scout case. Jones approached Chenault because she said she felt the Mays County Sheriff's Office and the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation wouldn't take her seriously. She also told her story to the Daily Press. And this matches the account that we saw in the video earlier about Jimmy Bryan's father, who said that nobody wants to listen to him, and that just reports that nobody wants to reopen the case, nobody wants to take anything seriously, from politicians to law enforcement agencies. Why? Is there a conspiracy afoot? Over the years, DNA evidence from the Girl Scout murders has deteriorated, and authorities are still trying to piece together what's left. Some people have called media outlets and claimed to have committed the crime, so sifting through the material is difficult. Chenault, Goss, and the other law enforcement source have asked that DNA... So one of them doesn't even feel comfortable identifying themselves. This is a law enforcement source. Have asked that DNA samples be collected from other persons of interest. Samples were eventually collected, but the status was never disclosed to those three. Chenault pointed out that while the triple murder is a Mays County case and not a Cherokee County one, they got involved after they learned about details they felt were too compelling to dismiss. So the neighboring county wants to solve the case more than the county law enforcement where it occurred. I mean, what does everybody make of that? As for the Duffields, Wesley died in prison while serving a life sentence for the murder of Jimmy Bryan. Jesse Darrell was charged as an accessory but was never convicted. He was later convicted on charges of rape by instrumentation, and upon his release from prison in 2010, he was again arrested for failure to register as a sex offender in 2013. He was sentenced to 3 years to the Department of Corrections with time served and was discharged in August 2021. Officials have not confirmed whether the Duffields ever had information related to the Girl Scout case, and that may be difficult since Wesley is dead. A contact number listed for Jesse Darrell when he registered as a sex offender is no longer in service. Other numbers provided him were also dead ends. What's next? I mean, this is quite bizarre, but this is an article, November 11th, 2021. So at least that's good. There's still some movement in the case. I thought we'd have to rely on obscure forums that, by the way, have been going over all of this information for many, many years. There's a couple other interesting tidbits just sifting through posts. Supposedly, multiple pairs of glasses were stolen from different tents during that night. So one pair was found with the bodies, one pair was found in the cave. I mean, this is kind of weird. So somebody went into multiple tents. I mean, there was the report that a man peered into a tent with a flashlight. Other reports stated it might have been a woman, but either way, did the perpetrator or perpetrators go into multiple tents at different times, possibly when some of them were sleeping, and steal glasses? I mean, you would think with all the interviews, the police would have been able to nail that down. A couple more interesting posts here on Unsolved Murder subreddit. The old locals know who did this. Too many murders happen in rural Oklahoma and are unsolved because no one will come forward with info. Two girls disappeared in '99 from Bethany, Oklahoma. Just last year, the case broke and there was an arrest. Everyone in town knew who did it. The Camp Scout Girl Scout murders. This camp was sold long ago and is now leased as a hunting land. Any clues are long gone. But Locust Grove knows who did this. Follow-up post here. It's funny you brought this up. The current sheriff actually stated that the police department was having issues with people withholding information from them, but that they were on the trail of numerous people with first-hand knowledge of the crime. Why do you think people are unwilling to come forward? For the sake of grieving family members? Or why not do it anonymously? I know there is the whole snitches are the dirt of the earth label, but that is what is happening here. I feel like this type of mindset is more common in gangs and prisons, not rural Oklahoma. Okay, so here's what we're here for. Let's go to the source of all of this information about the Boy Scout camp. So this was posted, unless it was copy-pasted from elsewhere, June 16th, 2007. Originally on Topics. This is posted someone named Darren in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I have called the OSBI and nobody will listen. I was a Boy Scout in Troop 17 at Camp Garland when those murders occurred. We had the first campsite at Camp Garland and only a quarter mile from Camp Scott. Those girls that were murdered were in the first campsite closest to Camp Garland. The first night of camp, we had 3 boys that bragged to the entire troop that they were going to go to Camp Scott that night to get some girls. They indeed went, and in the middle of the night returned and woke up a lot of us arguing. One boy was crying and saying he didn't want to get into trouble. The other 2 boys were angry and telling him to keep his mouth shut and they won't get in any trouble. The next morning, the police arrived and took all the boys 14 years and older into the campsite building for questioning. I was only 12. Myself and about 10 other boys told our scoutmaster about the 3 boys and what they said and did, but he told us to shut up and let the police do their job. Wow. So, who is this scoutmaster, and was he involved in some capacity? Or were those other boys relatives of the scoutmaster? The Mays County detectives and OSBI found a drunk Indian to blame this on, and they don't want to be embarrassed. I've even called KRMG and emailed Channel 8, and nobody wants to look into this. I guarantee if someone advertised to have members of Boy Scout Troop 17 come forward, you would get over a dozen that would remember those 3 boys and what they did. Those 3 girls and their families deserve justice. I ended up going to high school with 2 of those boys, and they were some of the roughest kids at Rogers High School, class of '83. I remember their names. He doesn't give their names here, though. Some responses here. If you look at the terrain between the 2 camps, it would be quite an undertaking to go from Garland to the west side of Camp Scott in the dark in the middle of the night. Anything is possible, but that scenario is extremely unlikely to me. I remember seeing a post somewhere from other boy in the Scouts in the same troop who said that there is nothing to the claim. Now, how would we know that's not one of those boys that's responsible saying that there's nothing to this claim? And then all of these coincidence theorists who wouldn't believe in this type of conspiracy could just write it off. Hypocritically believing one account and not the other. Obviously, we don't know if any of these accounts are true, but apparently Girl Scouts at Camp Scott did verify that boys from the other camp did sneak into their camp. And I believe girls snuck into the other camp as well. Again, these are just accounts. They could be false, but there's some corroboration here and there. Another poster posted something interesting. Could they have gone to the camp and seen the person or persons attacking the girls without being seen by the attacker? Well, even if they were seen by the attacker, did the attacker give chase and couldn't catch these quick 14-year-olds who have practiced sneaking in and out of this specific camp? I mean, who knows? Also, supposedly, some people are reporting that the girl in the other tent, who saw the girl in the next tent over, who saw a guy peek in with a flashlight, she identified Stevens, not Hart. But again, it could have been neither of them, or it could have been both of them. Couple more posts here. Camp Garland suspects. The aforementioned were both sophomores at Will Rogers High School in Tulsa in 1981. Their tent was supposedly located closest to the Garland entrance gate within sight of Highway 82. If any of the three alleged had prior knowledge of Camp Scott's layout, they could have headed west across Power Line Clearing flat area alongside camp's southern fence line leads to rear service gate where bodies were found. Informant initially suggested Boy Scout troop was number 17, but also indicated to me at least that the June 77 troop could also have been either number 20 or 25. Huh. Another interesting post here. I am not saying that the Boy Scouts did this, but I do believe they saw something. I think it was something that scared the living daylights out of them. Why else would they go back to camp and be worried about whether or not they would get into trouble? If there is a possibility that they were involved, I do not think they set out to kill those little girls. If, and I mean if they were involved, I think things might have gotten out of hand and it was a last-minute decision to do something so they would not be identified. Just my opinion. Another post from someone. No, I was not at camp that night. I was going to, but my mom decided to not let me go at the last minute. Huh, premonition of sorts. She thought I was too young yet and we were going to be on a big vacation that year. I am thankful today for that, but it still haunts me that I might have been there. Sorry it has taken me so long to answer this. I always check the boards, but it's been quiet for some time. I have been conducting research about this case and about other possible suspects. There are quite a few people that had the opportunity, but I have found nothing to substantiate anything I have learned. One of my good friends was at camp that night. She said she thought her and the girls in her campsite heard a scream, but when they stopped giggling and started listening, everything was quiet, so they chalked it up to normal noises. She said they never saw anything. Another post here. The bloody footprints also found at the murder scene inside the tent were a size 9. Hart wore a size 11. None of the investigators, searchers, or witnesses wore that size shoe before crime pictures were taken. The print's tread mark was of a wavy pattern. Some investigators and military veterans have suggested that the pattern was reminiscent of a military boot tread, specifically a jungle warfare boot circa Vietnam. On Jerry Weber's superb documentary on YouTube, Camp Scott Murders, a father stated that he believed his son, who was murdered soon after the Girl Scouts, may have participated in the murders or may have known information regarding the crimes. Another point here, what is the murder rate in that area? I mean, I can't imagine it's extremely high. I mean, maybe it is, but in 1977, if the average murders per year is 0, and now they're getting 4 within weeks of each other, is that too coincidental? His son belonged to a small group of boys who regularly hiked and lived in the surrounding region for years, including Camp Scott. Just hours after the murders were being broadcasted by the local news, the boys, including his son, came to his house and stated that they knew the victims. This would have been impossible considering none of the victims were from the area. The scouts had just arrived at the camp and had been at the camp less than a day prior to their murders. The father and his wife also noticed at least one of the boys had a strange shoe tread, like a tire tread pattern on the bottom of his shoes. So how popular was that of a pattern? Because if that's a rare pattern at that time, I mean that's more damning. But even if not, I mean that doesn't really mean anything. After his son's disappearance, the father, being suspicious, went to the sheriff and conveyed his belief that his son may be in danger from these boys. His murdered son's body was discovered 1 month later. The boys convicted of his murder stated that their reason for killing his son and their friend was because of a dispute over weed. The father stated in the interview with Jerry Weber that he was the first person to ask him about his beliefs and the murder of his son. He went on to state that the sheriff's department never made a follow-up regarding his suspicions. By the way, at least one of his son's murderers is still incarcerated by the Oklahoma Corrections Agency. He has been repeatedly denied parole. Another post here. I was there that night. It was my first time to go. I went as an individual, not with my troop, and I was 10. I had sleepless nights for a while and also had to meet with FBI at a nearby hotel in Tulsa shortly after returning home, and it all kind of faded from my memory. That is, until about 25 years later. I hadn't read any books or reports yet, but for some weird reason I'm thinking about it a lot lately. First, the things I remember. I remember my mom paying for me to go and how hard it was for her. We loaded buses in Tulsa at a parking lot and I don't know anyone. I remember arriving and being at a mess hall and meeting a young girl sitting outside on a curb or rock. She didn't know anyone either, so we chatted and promised each other we would get together for breakfast to meet there at the rock. Next thing I remember was walking in a straight line, grouped to our tents. I thought it was Kiowa, but now I don't know if that's a memory of things I heard in the news. I just remembered I had a hard time pronouncing it because I had never heard the tribe before. I'm confident I was the tent next to the last one. So 7, if anyone can confirm. I do know my tent was closest to the bathroom. We went there prior to the mess hall, but only long enough to slide our bags under the cots. So after dinner, we went back and I remember pulling my bag out and going through everything I had. My tent only had 3 girls. 2 cots lined each side. We chose to be toe-to-toe. My head was right inside to the left of the entrance. Our tent sides were rolled up, but it started lightly raining. Not heavy rain at all. Maybe because of the trees. My best memory is my senses. Maybe because I didn't know anyone and didn't talk much because of it. We unrolled our flaps but didn't tie them because it was humid. Right when it started getting dark, the screams started. I never experienced this before. The other 2 girls explained that everyone pulls pranks and tries to scare each other. Then they decided to go to the bathroom because it was too dark and scary to go alone. Plus the pranking. I didn't want to, so I stayed in the tent until I realized I was alone. I then ran after them. There were girls running and screaming everywhere. I couldn't see a thing, so I went back to the tent and they were there. We laid on the cots, talking. The girl at my feet all of a sudden said a man just opened her corner flap and shined a flashlight in her face. We stopped talking, never said another word. I pulled the blanket over my head and prayed to my dog that had died and for help. I was so scared and sweating like crazy. I could hear the screams far away and near and the sound of crunching leaves. I could hear drops of rain on canvas. I fell asleep. I woke up and everything was quiet except for bugs, maybe locusts or crickets. I laid there for a while thinking I needed to go to the bathroom, but there was no way I was going. Somewhere, probably 30 minutes to an hour, it felt like in silence. Then I started to hear screams in the distance or muffled, and I thought, there are still girls pulling pranks and the counselors don't care. It lasted maybe 10 minutes and then it was quiet. I fell asleep again at some point. When we woke, we had to hurry and dress and head to breakfast. Walking there, our group was stopped by another group and the counselors walked away a little to talk. When ours came back, she said we were to pick up as big of a rock that we could carry and to keep our eyes open for strange animals. We got to the mess hall and they made an announcement that a lot of things were vandalized in the night, so we couldn't swim or canoe. We were to go back to our tents and they would tell us what we would do instead. I looked and looked for my friend and waited outside and never saw her. I was so disappointed. Our group went back to the tents and within 30 minutes the counselors came running by saying pack everything in 5 minutes. We were leaving to go home. All I remember thinking is my mom is going to be so mad because she spent so much money. I remember the bus ride home was quiet. I remember being too scared to get off the bus and face my mom. I was the last off, and my mom was running around hysterically crying. We went straight to the car and drove home in silence. A block from my house, I remember apologizing. We came back, and she spent so much money. Then she says, do you not know what happened? Did they not tell you? I'm crying as I text this whole thing. Clearly, I should have been put in counseling. At some point, I told my mom about the man my tent mate said she saw, and I had to go in by myself into a hotel room with numerous FBI men and tell them what I could. I couldn't remember how to say my group's name or the names of the other two girls in my tents, sadly. Another interesting point here, posted by several people on this forum here, people that were there. So they stated that that some of the tents did not have 4 girls. They had 3 girls. They were supposed to have 4 eventually. It was the start of a 2-week session, and other campers were going to be coming the following week for a 1-week session. So it was incorrectly reported that only the last tent had 3 girls. So that note about killing three girls, that might have not been specific to that last tent, because several tents might have only had 3. Another chilling post here from this witness. After being told there was a man coming down the trail, we ran back to our tent and jumped in bed. After talking for a bit to the other 2 girls, the corner was opened at the backside corner of the tent by the bathroom. A counselor would not have done that. They would have checked from the front. After she told us that a man did that, we could hear footsteps walking along my side towards the front and then stopped. The only reason I think that the FBI dismissed my statement is that I couldn't remember the name of the girl that saw him, or that I couldn't remember the name of the tribe I was in, which makes me think they don't know either. I have to tell you, though, I have never read any other statements or accounts from other people until the first night I posted on this forum. I sent my whole recollection of my memory to a friend before I did to make sure my memory wasn't altered by what I read. It's just amazing to me the facts they put down for a girl in Kiowa is almost the same as mine. That's very smart to do as well, not to have memory contamination. Wow, I mean, here's the thing, though. There was, 140 girls? I mean, that's not that many. They couldn't, I mean, they couldn't find out that this guy, whoever this was, might have been going through multiple areas. Apparently, there's also reports here that there is confirmation that 3 to 4 Boy Scouts from the neighboring camp were questioned regarding the murders, but that's all there is. Here are some more interesting points made by other people. I don't know if they're local or not, but they have a lot of info here. Local hunters trespassing in Camp Scott, both in hunting season and out of season, was a chronic problem for decades. The caretaker frequently had to tell hunters to get out. You have to realize that it's not just sport hunters use that region. Locals hunt game year-round for food on the table. It is a generations-long habit, and one they still claim by treaty rights, whether or not those treaty rights have been rescinded. Official legal hunting seasons be damned. Locals also resented the presence of all camp kids in the immediate area. Camp Scott for Girl Scouts, Camp Garland for Boy Scouts, a Salvation Army camp for inner city kids, and several church camps that were located in that area. Locals resented having city people and their kids being there, disrupting hunting on those lands, yet not contributing to the local economy because the campers came and went without spending any money there. Camp Scott sat in the heart of the Cookson Hills, an area along the province of outlaws, both Native American and others. The majority of those living in the area at the time of the Camp Scott murders of the 3 girls were Native American, and resentment of having opened up tribal lands to ownership of land by whites was and still is greatly resented, especially ownership of land owned by outsiders such as the scout councils and various churches. There was a general disrespect by locals against the property rights of the camps. I mean, there's interesting points here. Trespassing in the camp by locals wasn't just hunters. There was a long history of theft of materials such as fire screens. Wow. Another point here, Kiowa unit was the most remote unit in the camp, easily accessible from closely adjacent private land. The girls' bodies were found right by a fence line, not far from a gate, easy to climb. This person actually is a local and someone who went to Camp Scott. Continuing on here, I camped 2 summers at Camp Scott, both times in the Kiowa unit. It was decidedly the most vulnerably located unit, and I went weekend camping during autumn and spring about a dozen times, mostly in the Quapaw unit, as well as in the Arapaho and Cherokee units, and Red Barn once each back in the 60s as a junior and cadet scout, and in 1970 and 71 as a senior scout. During several of those weekend campouts over a 7-year span of time, I personally witnessed 3 separate, very disturbing, scary incidents. First incident was in Quapaw unit on a cold autumn night with no wind. I woke terrified, but having no clue what had awakened me or why I was scared. I had not been having a nightmare. My sense was that something had touched or jostled the foot of my sleeping bag. I was sleeping with feet to the side of the tent and head towards the middle. None of the other 4 or 5 girls in the tent woke. After a few minutes, I crawled out of my sleeping bag and crept to peek out from between the tied-shut front flaps of our tent to the tent my mom and the other adult leader were in directly across the fire circle. The path to the latrine went directly beside the tent. I was going to untie the flaps and go to my mom, or at least call out to her, when I grew more terrified because I literally sensed danger. So I froze, staying silently crouched inside my tent, peering through the crack between the flaps. After a few minutes, seemed an eternity, a tree next to my mom's tent silently moved, disappearing down the trail and past the latrine, momentarily blocking the light from the lantern hanging on the front of the latrine, as would happen if an adult height person walked past. Despite the rocks and leaves that always crunched and rustled underfoot, there was no sound at all. Wow, if that doesn't make your skin crawl, oh man. And what would have happened if she did cry out for her mother? I mean, yeah, this is creepy stuff. So this was in... Okay, she doesn't say which year this was. This was with the Quapaw unit? So this is not... She just said this is throughout the 60s or 70 and 71. So between the 60s and 1971. So a number of years prior. And then, of course, there are many reports of just weird stuff happening in the what was it? The year before, even. But this is her account here. I mean, this is really creepy. So there was just a stalker there, just standing around. I mean, that's really creepy. I mean, I do remember seeing that myself with animals, where, I mean, even some larger animals, just from hiking, where you think it's a tree, especially if it's late at night, and it's actually an animal that just starts moving, and it's really creepy. And I can also kind of understand in those types of moments you sense something is off, and you really do just freeze. You just completely freeze. I guess that's just the reptile part of your brain, or whatever they call it, where you just know you have to freeze. There's no conscious decision to do it. It's just something that has to be done. I mean, this is really terrifying. Okay, let's continue on here. The second incident was also in Quapaw, during warm spring a couple of years later. Quapaw was across a rocky dirt road near the camp caretaker's house where he and his wife lived. Their outside cat that had strolled into the unit for petting the previous evening was freshly dead the next morning, with its head wrung almost backwards, with the body thrown into a brush pile down the road near Kiowa. Several of us girls and my mom found it when wood gathering. I mean, this is right out of a horror movie. The stalking, the animal deaths. The third incident was a year later, again in spring. So I'm assuming that first incident was in the late 60s or so. The third incident was a year later, again in spring, weekend camping in the Cherokee unit. 4 of us girls, then teenagers, went hiking with permission. On the trail paralleling the creek below the bluff, we came across a bizarre sight just off the trail. A circle of small white stones, about 12 to 18 inches in diameter, arranged neatly around a cleared patch of bare ground with a freshly dead squirrel with wrung neck neatly laid in the center. No sign of it being a snare trap. That scared the hell out of us, and we ran back to tell the adults, who didn't believe us and told us to quit making up stories. But when I got home that evening and told my mom, she believed me. Mom reported all 3 of those incidents in person at council headquarters when they occurred, but all 3 were discounted by paid staff as kids' wild imaginings, despite my mom having personally seen the dead cat, obviously with a wrung neck. Now add up all the many other reports from numerous troop leaders over the years of items stolen overnight, threatening notes left, strange men not the caretaker glimpsed in the woods. It is clear that there was a pattern of intimidation and trespassing going on for some years prior to the murders. I mean, this stuff is creepy. This is really creepy. I mean, wow. I mean, someone really does need to do a proper investigation, not just of that year, but I mean, it looks like the previous 10 years or so. As to who, one or more, committed the murders, I am certain that at least some locals damned well knew who was guilty and shielded him or them both then and to this day. It was someone who was a true sadistic sexual predator, whether Hart fit that profile or someone or more others. And as to Hart's heart attack shortly after being returned to prison to finish serving his earlier sentence for brutal rape of 2 women, I highly suspect his heart attack was from the kind of blow to the chest that causes the heart to stop or go into fatal arrhythmia, such as is taught in hand-to-hand combat training and in some forms of martial arts. You know what's weird about that is, did they do an autopsy? Because if he didn't have any kind of heart condition, I mean, if there really was no reason for him to have died, it does seem like that might have been murder. And why would he have been murdered? Is it somebody? Was it like a paid hit by people who wanted vengeance, or was it from the side of law enforcement or politicians who didn't want him to live long enough to, I don't know, possibly do follow-up DNA testing or whatever that might hurt the case? What I don't understand is how scientists can find identifiable DNA from ancient animal and human bones millions of years old, but cannot get a reading from evidence samples off the girls because the DNA is too degraded. That's a good point, too, because, I mean, obviously sometimes the DNA is too degraded. But if it's not degraded, would they say it was degraded? If this was a frame-up job and the DNA doesn't match, I mean, the disappearing fingerprints, another wrinkle in this case. Another post by this user: correction, the 2 summers I camped, 1 year was in Kiowa, the following year was in Arapahoe. And rechecking the map of the camp, the weekend camping trip when we found the squirrel laid out ritualistically, we may have been in Comanche instead of Cherokee. An interesting follow-up post here. The animal mutilations appear to be ritualistic in nature, almost Wiccan. Then again, the stones could have been placed around the remains of the animals to make it appear religious, when in fact the mutilations were the actions of a proto-sadist. A very young proto-sadist. I'm not familiar with Cherokee offerings or sacrifices like the scenes you describe. The walking tree incident indicates not only a familiarity with the camp, but a brazen pathology of the individual trespasser. As for DNA, you have to understand that the mtDNA that was tested in 2008 indicated 3 out of 5 hits that matched Hart. But they could also indicate a close relative of blood relation. That being said, OSBI made an estimate regarding Hart's kin in the immediate area. They concluded that Hart had at least 250 relatives living in the area circa 1977. We all know that Hart was a fugitive prior to the murders, and that his family and friends hid him for years. What most people don't know is prior to his conviction, he lived with his nephew, some would say a protege. The same nephew would be convicted of crimes against women. His whereabouts prior to and immediately after the camp murders have never been quantified. Now, in Cherokee culture, all children born Cherokee belong to the mother's clan. That being said, this gives us a clear lineage that mtDNA investigators can follow scientifically and on paper tribal roles. Since mtDNA traces the maternal line, then the results of any hits could be potentially enormous. The reason I mention Hart's nephew, it is my belief that more than one assailant committed the crimes. If Hart committed the crimes, I hypothesize he had an accomplice with him, maybe a close confidant, maybe a family member. It would make sense why mitochondrial DNA did not come back with a 100% hit on Hart, but a partial hit from the samples taken. It should also be noted that as far as I know, the latest test results performed about a year ago have not been released. So this post is from 2019, unless it was copy-pasted, but they did not release the results of the latest DNA test. Why? That's kind of weird. Can they be FOIA'd? I mean, what is going on? Is this even an active case? I suspect they did get a hit and are combing every available DNA resource, civilian and law enforcement, to find a match to what they have. Think the Golden State Killer and how he was caught. Here's another interesting post. I've been reading the book, and it seems to me that Hart was not a very savvy criminal, to put it mildly. He allowed his license plate to be seen by one of the 2 pregnant women, leading to his identification and arrest. He was idiot enough to break into an armed policewoman's apartment and then actually stayed in the apartment building to try other doors after leaving hers, instead of realizing that he had probably just gotten the police called on him, which he had, and getting the heck out of there as fast as he could to avoid them before they arrived. From what I've read of when he was questioned, he's an incredibly bad liar on top of all that. The murders were sloppily done, true, but I can't help but think that there was someone else involved who had a little bit more foresight than Hart. If it had been just him, I would almost expect him to have left a business card and a map to his whereabouts inside one of the sleeping bags. Interesting. Here's another little tidbit from one of the campers and locals. I truly believe people living in the area felt they were protecting Hart from the sheriff, who had a personal grudge against him. Something about marrying one of Hart's ex-girlfriends. What? Wow. That's messed up. Okay, so here's the last mind shock here. We're going to shift a little bit to another theory. I actually couldn't really nail down the source of this information, but this was posted on Unsolved Murders subreddit a year ago by Far Emu. You can't convince me that Jean Leroy Hart did it, because I'm convinced with all the evidence and lack thereof, the Girl Scout counselor's son that she brought on the trip but then shipped off to North Carolina the next day after the murders were discovered did it. There were also reports of the counselor's son peeping on the girls while they showered, but those reports vanished. I mean, some people always believed that there was some kind of a connection to a counselor. Now, someone is asking here about evidence. The poster here, Far Emu 2859, stated, "My aunt was there and saw him and was friends with the girls." Huh. Weird. So apparently this is just their aunt's account. Huh. Another post here with information I haven't seen before. So they may be reaching, but one of the counselors could have been in on a question mark. They did find female DNA and couldn't definitively state that it was one of the girls. I was thinking maybe she could have lured them out of the tent. The girls would have trusted her enough to come out. I can't imagine one man doing that to 3 girls with all the other tents around. And it seems like whoever was responsible was after a certain set of girls because he had peeked into another tent and didn't take them. So many unanswered questions and what ifs. It's a very sad and haunting case, to say the least. Yeah, I haven't seen any of it. I mean, they keep everything so hush hush, but is that the latest round of DNA testing? They found female DNA at the scene as well, which did not match to anybody there? I'm going to read one final article here to round out this episode, but yeah, we seem to only be scratching the surface in this case. I mean, quite a mind-shocking case. But regarding a female, the Oklahoman, posted June 25th, 2008, by Ron Jackson, was a female involved in the 1977 Girl Scout slayings. Recent DNA tests failed to identify the killer or killers who raped and murdered 3 Oklahoma girls June 13, 1977 at Camp Scott in Locust Grove. However, the tests revealed a partial female DNA profile. So this is the source of that information I mentioned earlier. Mays County District Attorney Gene Haynes announced Tuesday in a news release. Testing from a semen-stained pillowcase found at the crime scene failed to exclude all 3 of the victims or the possibility of a female attacker, adding to the stockpile of questions that already surround this enduring mystery. No answers for the families. The biggest question remains 31 years later, who killed Lori Lee Farmer, 8 of Tulsa, Michelle Goose, 9 of Broken Arrow, and Doris Denise Milner, 10 of Tulsa. Quote, "I've always felt in my gut that there was a girl present." This is a quote from Sherry Farmer, Lori's mother, told the Oklahoman. "So when I saw the DNA results, that was a concern with me. Lori was eventually excluded from the DNA match, and so was one of the other girls, I was told, but they couldn't exclude all 3 girls. Given the DNA results, you have to wonder if there wasn't also a female who took part in the murders." End quote. I am going to repeat the first part of that. This is Lori's mother, so call it instinct, call it what have you. This is what she said. "I've always felt in my gut that there was a girl present." Make of that what you will. I never discount the words of the mothers. Not that the father doesn't have instinct as well. Obviously they do. But a mother's instinct is nothing to scoff at. Look at all the cases where their instincts turned out to be true. Or even like the other mother's instinct who didn't allow her daughter to go on the trip because she just had a bad feeling about it. Haynes' statement didn't expound on the results. "It is unfortunate that the testing did not produce a DNA profile," Haynes said. "We had hoped the testing would bring an end to the debate over who committed these terrible crimes. The families of the victims certainly deserve an ending to the case. To date, the late Jean Leroy Hart is the only person to ever be charged with the murder of the 3 Girl Scouts. Hart, then 34 and a fugitive, had been spotted living in the Cookson Hills near Camp Scott at the time of the murders." Hart, however, was acquitted by a Mays County jury March 79. 2 months after his acquittal, Hart collapsed at the Oklahoma State Pen in McAlester from a heart attack while serving 308 years for unrelated rape, burglary, and kidnapping convictions. I feel badly for the families of those little girls who were murdered, said Garvin Isaacs, Hart's defense attorney. But Gene Leroy Hart was an innocent man who was falsely accused. Haynes had hoped new DNA testing would solve the mystery once and for all. And also keep in mind, this is from the 2008 round of DNA testing. This is not from the latest DNA testing using newer technology in the past few years, of which no information has been released. I'm going to read one more post here from Tapatalk. Also, keeping in mind here, I'll read a couple more posts. One of the shoe sizes was a 7. Not sure if they meant a man's 7 or a woman's 7. But even if it was a man size 7, that would be a woman's size 9 and would be bigger than average size for a woman. Also, if a woman was first to enter the tent, the girls would not have been so scared and screamed because they would have thought it was one of the counselors. Just a thought. From my understanding, the park ranger was the first to actually enter the tent and pull open the sleeping bags. As for the shoe size, one cannot tell if it was a male or female, adult or child shoe that left the bloodied prints. Only the shoe size in inches. Now understand this, 2 parents who lost their son immediately after the murders stated that he and his wife had an encounter with their son and his friends the day or 2 after at their home. The parents knew their son's friends having grown up together in the area. These boys were all teens at the time of the murders. They lived in the adjacent county. One of the boys mentioned he knew the girls when they all heard or watched the news broadcast about the murders. This would have been impossible. The scouts were not native to the area, they weren't teenagers, and none of the boys were from the Tulsa region. During this revelation, the parents noticed a strange tread pattern on one of the boys' shoes. The parents made note of this and the conversation and dismissed it. A month later, their son, who went missing, his body was discovered sometime later. These 4 murders were the only 4 murders of children in that area. He was supposedly killed for reneging on a weed transaction. Their son was not a drug dealer. The father and mother did not believe that this was the reason for their son's murder, even though that was what the murderer of their child confessed. They both figured it had to be something else. Weed grows wildly in the region. Regardless, the parents went to the local sheriff and stated their belief that their son either knew something about the Scout murders or was a participant. The local sheriff and state law enforcement never followed up on their statements. It wasn't until 13 years later that a Tulsa news reporter brought this information to the public. Then there is the Boy Scout camp that was nearby, young boys all with a few adult male supervisors. So some interesting points here. So there's basically 2 different theories regarding young-ish boys. So young teens who were sophomores at the high school, or possibly these other boys who were not Boy Scouts, just simply locals in the adjacent county. But 2 of the boys, the son's friends, grew up in that area. Okay, this is all really weird. So there you have it. Different theories, more information. Basically, we went over a lot of the information that's available. There are a few other theories and a few other suspects that we will be going into, as well as other strange happenings in the area. But what we went over is so creepy because these are, how many accounts have not been reported? I mean, this was so long ago. I mean, some of the campers, unfortunately, could have died in car accidents, whatever, of all the previous years. Or some might just not be comfortable sharing the stories, but one can only wonder, how many more creepy accounts are there? From walking trees, to dead animals being found, to random pranks being pulled. How much of it was from the boys? Again, let's not fall for false dichotomies here. How much of these are simple pranks by girls within the camp or by the Boy Scouts in the neighboring camp? And how many of these activities are actually being perpetrated by others in the area, whether disgruntled Native Americans or other local hunters who are upset with the camp. I mean, there's just so many people that could be responsible for some of these thefts and pranks and stalking incidents. I mean, they're just downright creepy. And the other thing that's kind of weird, I mean, it's not that weird, but how many campers would not have been exposed to any of this type of activity? Because obviously there's not creepy things going on 24/7. These are I don't want to say they're super isolated incidents, but there's a number of incidents, but there would also probably be many campers who had a great experience and who never encountered any of this, even if it was going on around them, which is even, I mean, that's really creepy in and of itself. I mean, there's guys stalking around tents. A certain percentage of campers that were either dead asleep or whatever, that were fast asleep or whatever, they wouldn't have even heard or noticed, even though it was going on. And they would be none the wiser. Yet others personally witnessed some of this activity. All very, very creepy. Hope you guys found another edition of MindShock True Crime interesting and informative. As always, if you want to support the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. You can also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube for access to exclusive streams and chats. Share across social media, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topological analysis, co-podcast requests. You can also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.